Firstly, hello to everyone. Welcome, and we're really excited to present to you today. And I always enjoy doing these joint webinars, joint panel discussions with different companies and people from different backgrounds. And so that's what we're doing today. This is a joint panel / webinar with between Sqope and IQEQ. And my name is Lev Yuriditsky. I'll be presenting today alongside Alex Stickler and Mark Harlan, both from IQEQ, and I'll introduce them in the next slide and let them also speak about themselves as well. And we're doing this together. It's not random. It's because we as Sqope are part of an offering that IQEQ has to its customers. It's the IQEQ Compass service, and this has a lot to do with ESG. And each one of us that are involved in it, each one of us that are involved in the panel, have a good amount of experience with it and from different angles, which I think is will really add to the discussion, really add to our ability to answer questions from unique angles, and allow us to present a really interesting webinar for you. And I hope you all agree. So without further ado, I'll introduce the topics and the speakers for today. So like I said, my name is Lev Yuriditsky. I'm the head of intelligence of Sqope S.A. We're a Luxembourgish company, but I'm based in Tel Aviv, where our research and intelligence division is based as well. Alongside me today will be Alex Stickler, who will be kicking off the presentation. I should say also, I will be speaking about ESG reputation and why it's important. Alex, who will be speaking about what exactly is ESG and what are its financial implications for businesses. He is the commercial manager for investor solutions at IQEQ. And afterwards, Mark Harlan will be speaking about the challenges with ESG rating methodologies. And Mark is the head of sustainability at IQEQ. So I'll let them all give their own introductions of themselves and their experiences. But I'll pass it on right now to Alex.
Thanks, Lev, and pleasure to speak with everyone today. So yeah, my name is Alex. I'm the commercial manager for our investor solutions division at IQEQ and been here just over 3 years now. And IQEQ, we're one of the largest service providers globally for splitting across 3 different client regions. So we support funds, so investment funds, whether that be hedge, private equity, real estate, infrastructure, etc. From an administration and a compliance perspective, we support corporate entities and corporate structures with domiciliation and administration purposes. And then we also have a private wealth section where we support high net worth individuals with trust and legacy planning. So we're a global business and we're spread across 24 jurisdictions globally, constantly increasing in our size. We actually just announced an acquisition on our website yesterday in the US. We're now up to almost 4,000 people globally. So a really global business, and happy to speak with you today to walk through how we kind of see ESG, how we've been supporting clients, and what potential implications it might have for your business. So thanks for joining us. Obviously, we're fresh off the back of COP26, which I'm sure a lot of people have been aware of. So I'm sure everyone's been kind of paying attention to the talks and discussions which have engrossed world leaders for the past few weeks. We'll touch on a little bit later some of the key takeaways and how they affect investment firms. But what's clear is that not enough is being done. So from ESG as a whole, and especially on climate, which was the real focus of COP26 for the last few weeks. So a lot of the talk there focused on how the richer developed countries had agreed in 2009 to provide $100 billion a year to poorer nations to help mitigate the climate crisis. Unfortunately, each year, this number has not been hit. For instance, in 2019, only 80 billion of this was provided to the poorer nations. But however, this number falls drastically short of the actual required amounts to combat the climate emergency. So the International Energy Agency has now estimated the annual figure to supporting this is not 100 billion or even a trillion, but between 2.6 to 4.6 trillion dollars a year in funding for low-income countries to mitigate and adapt to this climate crisis. John Kerry, who's America's chief negotiator, in a speech at COP26 said this is a number that no government is going to be able to support. And I put a quote at the top there, which I thought resonated quite powerfully with me. From Patricia Espinosa, who's the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in her ending speech for COP26, she noted, this is a question of the long-term survival of humanity on this planet. So quite an important topic. And what can we do about this? So I'm sure everyone's familiar with environmental, social, and governance, or ESG factors. At the moment, when you're looking at investing, but quite often it's just mentioned as more of a regulatory hassle for firms. It's something people have to do just from a regulatory perspective. There are, however, clear and direct benefits from employing strong ESG processes across your business. And I'm going to walk through some of these today and how this can be a real benefit and an impact across your firm. So Anderson and Sarson in 2016 both released reports stating that there's clear evidence that shows publicly listed companies with better ESG scores have a lower idiosyncratic risk against companies in their sectors. So in many ways, ESG is a risk management exercise where companies seek to reduce the risk of their operations, damaging the environment or controlling the potential negative outcomes from failures of these in their corporate governance. A great example of how these negative impacts or outcomes can be detrimental to firms can be seen from the Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, in the Fukushima Daiichi disaster of March 2011. There was a nuclear disaster in 2011 in Japan, which was caused by a tsunami. And 18 years prior to this, there was clear scientific knowledge that there was likely to be an earthquake in the area, which would trigger a tsunami. And obviously, from a governance perspective, this is obviously something that the firm should be looking at, but nothing was done to make sure that this would be solved or to help this. So there was no action taken on the back of this information. Unfortunately, as a result, there were 16 injuries and TEPCO lost over 80% of its share price. So from a financial perspective and a humanitarian perspective, it's obviously very important to be looking at these and having an impact. Obviously, we see there's a long-term horizon or a long-time horizon. Again, that research came out 18 years prior, so it's not something that's necessarily going to affect your business instantly, but over the long term, it will stop you having these real tail risk actions across your business. So let's apply this to some of the sectors that we might be investing in. Real estate development, as an example, takes place at the intersection of many important ESG issues, including inequality, food, water, energy, and climate change. The International Energy Agency notes that buildings and building construction sectors combined are responsible for over 1/3 of global energy consumption and nearly 40% of total direct and indirect CO2 emissions. Because of this, the emphasis quite often tends to be on the E section of real estate, but there's also strong S and G factors to consider as well. So from an S or a social perspective, for real estate, we can look at things such as the air quality of the buildings, the green space accessibility around the buildings, general accessibility to the building itself, the efficient use of land areas, the location or the closeness to local amenities. So looking at these risks and then making sure that from a social perspective, our buildings or the assets we're investing into are socially compliant, this can save some of the risks that we see on the board today. So obviously tenancy turnover perspective is huge for a real estate firm or a real estate investor. So if you're making sure that the social side is being looked at alongside the E and the G, but if these social areas are being looked at, you're going to see less tenancy turnover. So you have a stronger financial balance sheet, you have a longer weighted average lease expiry, and all in all, from a investment perspective, you will see greater returns by making sure that you are employing and building on this kind of ESG strategy internally. Again, we can look at building damage. From an environmental perspective, it's good to make sure that there's not going to be excess flooding. From a hedge fund, for instance, again, we look at different areas here. So it's not necessarily looking at the direct asset being held, but how the hedge fund is structured and managed. So the emphasis for hedge funds tends to be more on the governance perspective. So looking at the transparency of the fund's leadership team and their backgrounds, the roles and the independence of the directors. Again, we see some of the risks which can transpire here. For instance, if we're looking at the transparency risk, so looking at how does the investor know what they're investing into, and also the concentration risk, which can be gathered from hedge funds being overly invested into a specific asset. So as an example of this, and a good example from January of this year, is the GameStop incident and the GameStop short, where GameStop ended up roughly 140% of the liquid float was shorted for GameStop, and Melvin Capital ended up highly overexposed when the stock price went up, and it caught on Reddit. And because of this, Melvin Capital in Q1 2021 reported a 53% losses. So again, making sure that from a governance perspective, and you're investing into these assets with a clear headset and your clear structure, it stops that potential tail risk of your operations and reduces the ability to lose money downside. And how do you kind of support this? How do your investors support this? So the Standards Board for Alternative Investments built the Open Protocol template. So this helps standardize the collection, collation, and representation of risk information in alternative investment funds and specifically hedge funds. So this allows for the standardization of risk monitoring and the managing and reporting at that portfolio level to be able to provide that information to investors while protecting the specific asset allocation data for those hedge funds. So again, allowing you to provide that information to your investors without giving away the alpha of all of the underlying assets that you might be invested into. So obviously taking the GameStop as an example, what we see and what I quite often refer to in ESG is that it's not the phrase you often hear, spend money to make money. But with ESG, I often say it's spend money to not lose money. And it's reducing that downside tail risk from what can happen in an adverse effect, which can really kind of save your balance sheet and help you alleviate and build that alpha over the long period. And taking private equity as an example as well. So obviously in private equity, it's a bit different again, because you're actually buying and building these businesses yourselves. So the culture of ESG has to come from the top down in these firms. So again, we're looking at different risks here. We're looking at management risk, which is the risk the manager's doing something potentially not aligned with the objectives of the investors. The asset risks are the risks that's applied directly to those investments, and indeed the stakeholder engagement there. So making sure that the managers and the stakeholders are aligned in their kind of expectations and the intentions from the fund. Again, by implementing that ESG strategy internally at the manager, what this can do, and the ways you can do this, is looking at a formal commitment to ESG internally, setting out ESG related objectives. And this includes building out of potentially an ESG or ESMS, so an ESG management system internally, engaging and communicating with these stakeholders. So using your LPs as an example, they need to be involved early on to help you align with the objectives of those specific LPs to ensure there aren't these risks popping up later down the line. And once all of these kind of processes are implemented in the manager and in the business, this automatically trickles down to the conversations that are being had at the portfolio company level. So if you are speaking around ESG within the manager, this goes down to your conversations at the portfolio company level, and it improves that ESG structure over the long period, which helps them focus on that ESG and reducing risks over the long time horizon. If I want to move to the next slide, Lev. Thank you very much. So what's the benefits of this? So obviously we touched on some of these benefits throughout the last slide of actively having a strong ESG strategy and really looking at ESG as a business. And the first and the main one of these is that it increases your risk adjusted returns. So again, it reduces that tail risk and the risk that your assets are going to lose great value from an adverse effect or adverse media, which can stop these adverse effects damaging the share price. But this also can lead to an increasing ESG strategy can lead to an increase of share price at exit, which we note as ESG alpha. So this is when companies that are well governed and they're maybe a sustainable company, they're often trading at exit, especially in the private space, at a premium to others in their sector because they've taken the time to actively implement these strategies. And there's real reports and information around this to say that it's actually being implemented, and you're going to get this alpha at exit. It gives you a reduction in your reputational risk. So this is something Lev's going to cover in his presentation later on, but having these strong ESG management internally leads to a reduction in the volatility of your stock price or the price of the companies, and it reduces the risks of potential scandals in these companies as well. Addressing the stakeholder concerns. So this is actually looking at potentially DFIs or endowments when they're investing. They often use a negative screening approach to ESG. So again, if you are looking at ESG and employing that in your business, that automatically opens you up to receiving revenue and accessing capital from those other investors which wouldn't otherwise invest into your funds or into your structures. And then finally, doing the right thing. So this is in relation to many endowments and foundations that are funded or founded specifically to benefit a specific cause, which could be education, it could be healthcare, it could be religion. So again, making sure you're doing the right thing, as you say, allows you to open up to this capital when raising. So all of the above can lead to an increase in shareholder value and an increase in profitability for the underlying businesses. So really taking ESG into account and implementing a strong kind of process and a governance around ESG in your business will lead to stronger financial returns in the future. At this stage, I'll pass on to Mark, who I think is going to talk more around the actual ratings methodologies and the problems which align with this.
Thanks, Alex, and good afternoon all. My name is Mark Harland. I'm the head of sustainability here at IQEQ. I've been in the job for close on 4 months now, so relatively new to the organization, but really pleased to say that we're already starting to make progress on our own ESG journey. So if I can start by saying that I think companies and businesses shape the prosperity and destiny of our society on a global scale. For me, the company is one of the most effective tools available for wealth creation and will be at the center of the solutions to the many problems we as a collective humanity face. But left unchecked, the converse has proven to be true. There are many examples, TEPCO being one, as Alex notes, but the one that left an indelible mark on me and the one that stands out for being one of the largest corporate disasters is the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. That event killed 11 people, cost BP billions and billions of dollars, brought the Gulf's maritime economy to a halt, and caused unparalleled human and environmental devastation. The ramifications are still being felt a decade later. At the time, I was working as an ESG analyst in an asset management firm in London, and this event, more so than any other, convinced me that the investment industry was indeed complicit in some of the dangers associated with the BP disaster, including poor governance, poor corporate culture, misaligned and incorrect incentives, and a weak commitment to corporate purpose. And while I cannot claim that the Deepwater catastrophe ushered in a new era for companies, it cannot be denied that it certainly had contributed to the development of stakeholder governance, a governance model that encourages and relies on corporate leaders to serve the interests of all stakeholders and not only those of shareholders. As the Future of the Corporation program notes in their 2018 and 2019 reports, trust in business and its impact on people and the environment, along with globalization and technological disruption, is driving a shift in business. Their research argues for a need to develop a new framework for the corporation around well-defined and aligned purposes, complemented by ethical cultures and commitments to trustworthiness. If we move to slide 3, but how do we identify those companies genuinely involved in sustainability versus those that are paying lip service to the ideals of sustainable development? In other words, those involved in greenwashing, how do we identify these companies? One way we tackle greenwashing is through transparency and therefore reporting. But in order to report, we must first measure something. Many of you will recognize this quote. Next slide, please, Lev. From Peter Drucker. What gets measured gets managed. However, few, I would argue, know the full quote, that what gets measured gets managed, even if it's pointless to measure and manage, and even if it harms the purpose of the organization to do so. Albert Einstein put it slightly differently in saying, not everything that counts, he said, can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. What is so powerful about this is that it serves as a stark warning for all of us relying on data and reporting to understand businesses. As we all know, ESG has climbed the corporate agenda significantly over the last few years, aided and fueled by COVID, and sustainability has become a strategic issue for all businesses. But what exactly is important to each business differs substantially, and it is here where this warning is most relevant, as there is an array of ESG reporting frameworks, guidelines, and standards for companies to choose from. And from a reporter's perspective, it is difficult to know which framework to choose, whilst at the same time, the reporting burden is significant. From an investor's perspective, it is very difficult to know how to compare one company versus another if they're using different reporting standards, while the proliferation of standards increases the risk that companies engage in greenwashing. Further, there is academic opinion which suggests that reporting on the standard set of ESG metrics may not yield any value to the organization or to its stakeholders, instead arguing for an approach to ESG measurement that is pragmatic and which creates a differentiation advantage. In other words, ESG reporting should add value for the organization and its stakeholders, helping companies develop their moat, all the while ensuring that the business has a positive impact on communities, customers, society, and the environment. And finally, there is the question of materiality. That is what matters to one organization in a particular sector may not matter to another organization in the same sector. And this is certainly the case for companies in different sectors. We then require a reporting regime, which firstly makes sense for the business, both in terms of operational efficiency and in the strategic sense. And then secondly, the reporting needs to be useful for investors and other stakeholders. Fortunately, and I would argue in the nick of time, the IFRS Trustee Board announced recently at COP26 the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. The ISSB will consolidate the sustainability reporting landscape, providing a comprehensive global baseline of high-quality sustainability disclosure standards. The ISSB standards will enable companies to provide comprehensive sustainability information for the global financial markets. The standards will be developed to facilitate compatibility with requirements that are jurisdiction-specific or aimed at a wider group of stakeholders. We know, as Alex highlighted earlier, that there is ample evidence supporting the management and measurement of sustainability factors. However, what is unclear is how permanent any of the value created is. If we go to the next slide, please, Lev. Professor Alex Edmonds of the London Business School notes in his research that these improvements in corporate performance, as you can see them here, can be eroded away over time through imitation and competition. That is, the focus on hard quantitative metrics fails to deliver the long-lasting impacts often promised. To encourage permanence, Professor Edmonds argues that companies need to enrich their quantitative reporting with a qualitative approach to gathering information about their business. That is, businesses need a pragmatic, principled approach to sustainability assessment rather than sustainability measurement. We go to the next slide. The critics will argue that such an assessment is subjective and unreliable. They bemoan the inconsistency of ESG ratings and argue that greater disclosure will allow sustainability to be objectively assessed. But this criticism seems disingenuous to me, chiefly because how companies are valued in the mainstream are inherently subjective, depending on not only on current financials, but also management quality, competitive position, and strategic outlook. As a result, analysts disagree on whether a stock is a buy or a sell and what the price target should be, but no one bemoans this inconsistency. Moreover, the importance of soft information is an attraction often and not a drawback. So sustainability, as Lev will discuss, is no different. That is, it's inherently subjective and depends on soft information. And investors therefore need information that goes beyond the metrics to get into the weeds of a company in order to add value. Professor George Serafim of Harvard University, and a major voice amongst the sustainability profession, supports this view with a paper in 2021. He and his co-author found that, in fact, counterintuitively, greater disclosure leads to greater ESG disagreement, and that rating providers disagree more about ESG outcomes than inputs, and that disclosure appears to amplify disagreement more for outcomes. These findings, which highlight that ESG disclosure generally exacerbates ESG rating disagreements rather than resolving it, gives us further reason to be cautious about what we are measuring. Disclosure for disclosure's sake doesn't appear to add any value for stakeholder or the company. In fact, according to Professor Serafim's research, it exacerbates return volatility, creates larger price movements, and results in a lower likelihood of issuing external financing, amongst other negatives. However, there is an ever-growing demand for ESG metrics and rating providers, investors, a greater demand for ESG metrics from ratings providers, investors, and other stakeholders. A major driver of this insatiable appetite for data is the rise of quantitative investing methodologies, which account for a significant amount of AUM. Another driver is the investors' desire to compare companies over time and across sectors. And these investors tend to be skeptical about companies' varying metrics, and so demand consistency in the data reported, regardless of whether what that data is material for the business or not. So we have a disconnect. On the one hand, we have a need for more homogeneous data, while on the other, we need and have to be more discernible about the heterogeneous data that we produce. I'll now turn back to Alex to talk a little bit more about reporting and what IQ and EQ offer our clients.
Thanks, Mark. So just before I do touch on that, there's a couple other areas or kind of findings from COP26 that I thought I'd share, which again, I think link very, very nicely into what I'm about to say and the reporting side of things. So I've got a quote there from Antonio Guterres, who's the UN Secretary General, and he cast doubt on some of the commitments being made by nations at COP26. So on Thursday or last Thursday, he said, "Promises ring hollow when the fossil fuels industry still receives trillions in subsidies as measured by the IMF, or when countries are still building coal plants, or when carbon is still without a price, distorting markets and investors' decisions." So this rings true for the fund managers as well. So going from that initial or foundation stage, so just having an ESG disclosure or building just an internal ESG policy, moving to that advanced achievers phase where you're actively implementing what you're saying in terms of ESG. That's the challenge that we're trying to move ahead and help clients with, because that's where we're going to see the real value rather than just potentially an empty promise or just something that we can disclose and say we're going to commit to without actually committing to it. So when we're moving to that advanced achievers phase and information is actually being implemented, this will lead to the financial benefits that we saw above. Not only from the reduction in the tail risk, but also from increases in productivity, increases in shareholder value at exit, etc. And another of these key takeaways, which I thought was really interesting, was that they were talking around the fact that we need to close the information gap, facilitating adaptation to help build societal resilience against the impacts of climate change before we can address the protection gap. So obviously this is in relation to climate change, but again, this can be echoed in the fund or investor reporting space. As investors quite often there's a disconnect between what a manager is collating and what an investor is looking for. So we've really seen from speaking to clients and our research in the market that there's two questions that investors want to see. So they're looking at what's actually going on at the underlying asset level in terms of ESG, and how do they know that that's improving or getting better over time. So investors are really crying out for that understanding and that support. For the climate change piece, the Global Resilience Index Initiative, or the GRII, are really aiming to help kind of level that gap and help people get more aligned with the information around climate change. And then with the fund space, that's what we at IQEQ are trying to help our clients with, to bridge that information gap and allow us to move to the protection gap, so we start adding the real value in terms of this ESG reporting in society. So we built out an entire product or solution around this, which obviously we have some consultancy pieces to help clients understand what specific metrics are relevant for yourselves. So again, getting that balance between the homogeneous data for accurate kind of comparison across companies in the same sector, but also the heterogeneous data, which is relevant for you as a business and that company. And we're helping our clients collate and report on that information to understand from an internal perspective how that's performing, and also provide that information back to investors. So once that information gap is bridged, we can move forward into the protection gap and actually start building and adding some real value in terms of ESG reporting for our clients. On that note, I'll pass on to Lev, who'll walk through some more of the reputational assessment piece from a Sqope perspective.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, Mark. I really like the discussion today, and I think what's really neat is that, you know, kind of to Mark's point about you know, distinguishing between greenwashing and genuine efforts to improve ESG within different companies. You know, I think what's nice about this conversation, your guys' points, is the idea that we're getting from that kind of the good feelings or the more PR oriented discussions that ESG is often surrounding ESG, and getting more into the bottom line, you know, the metrics behind it, the benefits for businesses, and why you should do it beyond beyond just a PR campaign, so to speak. Before I get into my presentation, and it's relevant to what I'm saying now, I also want to say, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but I already see that some people are writing questions to me. So if you thought of anything during Alex's and Mark's speech, as well as mine, of course, then please, you can write it in the chat directly to me or to everyone, or you can write in the Q&A, whichever you prefer is fine, and we'll have an open discussion about every question at the end of my presentation. So I'll be speaking today about ESG reputation, which I think kind of ties everything together in a way. You know, discussing, we've discussed the numbers, we've discussed the different metrics and things like that, and I think it's important to discuss ESG from a strictly reputational perspective, and that's something that we at Sqope do a lot of. We do ESG reputational assessments, which, like I said earlier, is part of the IQEQ Compass offering. And I won't get too much into the details of what exactly we evaluate, but I will bring up later why we do what we do and why we do it in the way that we do it. So before I do that, I will introduce a very general concept of reputation. And I think before we speak about ESG reputation, we need to be on the same page about just reputation and how it impacts business in general. So let's start with reputational risk. I'll define it simply as the potential for deeds or actions, be they inadvertent or intended, of an individual or an entity to negatively impact the perception of a company. And this is important for a few reasons. One is that no matter what you do, perception can be as important as reality, and sometimes perception is reality, or it could be more important than reality in the eyes of the beholder, essentially. So it is very relevant to all businesses. And if the perception of your company damages the reputation, it's important to note that that your company can be significantly, your company's bottom line can be significantly impacted negatively by this sort of reputational damage, which can be caused by the actions of executives or shareholders, partners, clients, as well as company policy. And I say that I will emphasize it later because I want to stress that it's not just what's happening in your company. It's not just what you do and what you can control directly. A lot of it has to do with a lot of the perception of your company has to do with your partners, who you affiliate with. And I'll give a couple examples of that later, but I'm sure we've all seen it. And I'll end this point with a quote from Benjamin Franklin, which I really like, that says, "It takes many good deeds to build a good reputation and only one bad one to lose it." So now I'll tie this into ESG. So you'll recognize a couple scandals here. One of them being the Volkswagen Scandal from some years back, in which they misrepresented, or the numbers were misrepresented with regards to their emissions, and this significantly significantly impacted them from a bottom line perspective. I believe their stocks dropped by approximately 35%. So there was material damage as a result of this. And another example that I'd like to give is that of David Portnoy. And this is a very recent case. It's something that's currently ongoing. And this has to do with why I bring up that perception is reality. Because, and also why it's important to note that, well, let me start with something else in the meantime. Actually, this would be better this way. Essentially, like I said earlier, ESG has become the new standard for reputation. That's why I'm talking about both of them together. When you think about the reputation of a company, it's built on many different factors beyond its performance as a business. And those reputational factors all kind of tie into ESG. ESG is broken into the three different categories that matter to the general public. And just a few examples here is about the public judging company by the treatment of its employees, its political and societal engagement or disengagement, its environmental impact, its the behavior of its executives, and things like that. So basically the things that we hear most days in the news and in the public discussion with regards to a company, regards to a company's reputation, has to do with factors that are all kind of part of ESG. Indeed, the very implementation of ESG, or the lack of implementation of ESG efforts, carries reputational impacts by itself. And important, and this goes to the point I wanted to make earlier, is that some ESG factors are measurable, objective, and clear. A lot, especially the ones that have to do with the environment. There are sort of standards for this. There are standards with regards to equality between different minorities, between the different genders, making sure that both are getting paid equally. There are ways to measure this for the most part. That said, there are other factors that relate to ESG, which are more subjective and influenced by perception and popular opinion. You can have a very equitable company. You can have a company that pays its employees well, takes care of them well, offers all the relevant benefits. You can have a company, and I'll get into one of these in just a moment, that has zero emissions for the most part, has great recycling practices, and has very good E-score, so to speak. And its entire supply chain is totally clean, which is also very important. But the perception of its ESG can be impacted by something that effectively the company is innocent from. And the example I give here is of David Portnoy, and it's a very recent scandal in a way that's why I bring it up, because I think it's quite relevant. And he is the founder of Barstool Sports, and essentially right now there's the conclusion of an 8-month investigation into him by a rival media company, by Business Insider, which concluded with essentially an expose of some sexual scandals he's been involved in. And what's important to note is that essentially, and this isn't me bringing a criticism of Business Insider, but the effort was an 8-month effort to find something against David Portnoy. They targeted him specifically. And after all this effort to find something that they can criticize him, that something that is not palatable to the general public today, they unsurfaced a sort of sexual scandal. And in the end, the scandal was essentially something that had to do with sexual preferences, with the number of women he was involved in. But in the end, everything was consensual and completely legal. And the reason I bring this up, it's not, it shouldn't be taken in a way of a defense or in anything of David Portnoy, but the idea is that admittedly, he did nothing illegal. There's no criminal charges against him. He did some things that were basically belonged in the bedroom, and it's not for public attention. But as a result, this will impact this has impacted the perception of Barstool Sports, and this has impacted it from an ESG perspective. Essentially, because an executive from the company did some behaviors that, again, they weren't something that were illegal. They weren't something that even had to do with the company, but they still impacted it. And just to say that this impact is not just on paper. It doesn't just stay in the media or in social media. One of the companies that holds significant shares of Barstool Sports was called Penn National Gaming. Their stocks dropped by about 20% as a result of the scandal, and it's not even the company itself. So one thing that's important, and I'll bring this up later, is also conducting thorough research on all your partners, all your suppliers, your shareholders, and companies you hold shares in. This can impact your reputation as well. And another point that I think is important to recognize here, and I'll bring up another example momentarily, is that you can do everything to improve your reputation by improving your ESG policies and trying to match the ESG standards of the day, but that by itself cannot protect you against a scandal. So the best way to protect yourself against a scandal is actually just by conducting very thorough research. And again, this is what we offer to our clients. We offer in-depth research, not just of a company that one of our clients wants to invest in or get involved in some way. We do a thorough investigation also of their suppliers, of their partners, of their executives, and try to uncover any potential risk that's involved in it. Again, you can't be completely safe ever, but the best you can do is conduct that level of research and really examine everyone that could be possibly involved in the company and whose name can sully your reputation. A really interesting other recent example with regards to this is the Boohoo scandal. And what's interesting about them is that then this relates to the gap between what's actually on paper and what people believe about your company, the perception versus reality. So Boohoo is essentially an online fashion retailer, or it's called a fast fashion company. And it turned out that one of their suppliers, or some of their suppliers, were using underpaid labor. And I don't mean poorly paid labor, I mean labor that's illegally paid, essentially below the minimum wage standard. And the interesting thing about this is Boohoo was actually listed as an ESG positive company. It was listed in ESG ETF. So people invested in it partly because they believed that it had good ESG policies. But despite that, it was because of their suppliers that they were removed from these lists, and they had to do a lot of damage control as a result. And recently, they actually cut its network of suppliers by more than 400 firms, and as an effort to restore faith in its products. And it's interesting to say that because it means that there were about 400, there are hundreds of firms that now they realize they shouldn't have trusted, which they could have done due diligence on before, and then come to that conclusion before partnering with them. But clearly they didn't. So that's why I think it's really important to basically manage the gap between perception and reality. And it's also important to note that if the perception of your company or the perception of an entity is greater than the reality, this isn't always a good thing. Now, some people aim to present a more positive image than is the truth, but in the end, this can come back and backfire on you, because people then they tend to feel a bit manipulated. They tend to feel that they were lied to. It's much more important to actually bring efforts to hold up ESG standards and present it accurately. And related to the things that I was mentioning earlier, related to these two scandals, I want to emphasize how important it is that beyond doing everything that you can to maintain positive ESG standards, you also need to have guidelines to deal with the unforeseeable. You need to have guidelines in place and a plan in place in case of any scandals involving your executives, involving your suppliers, anyone along your supply chain, your partners, your customers. You need to have an idea of what to do in case something does go wrong. So that's really important element of managing ESG reputation. So with that, I want to conclude the presentation portion of the presentation and move on to questions. So I have a few already, but again, you're welcome to ask more. If you have any questions, feel free to continue to write into the chat box or in the Q&A. But I'll start some questions I received. And first one I think is interesting. Is anything driving the standardization in ESG metrics? And I think that's probably a good one for Mark to kick off with.
Yeah, thanks, Lev. So certainly, and as I mentioned, the IFRS during COP26 launched what is is going to be the International Sustainability Standards Board, and that is going to create the baseline for all things sustainable reporting going forward. It's going to be enshrined in corporate law, so this is going to be along the same lines as your standard corporate reporting. So I think that's a really important driver of consolidation around the sustainability standards. It's important to recognize that what's going into making, excuse me, what makes up the new standards under IFRS is SASB, which is the Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards, TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and those two, as well as the CDSB. I know there's lots of acronyms here, so forgive that, but it's the Carbon Disclosure Standards Board. So those three organizations have kind of amalgamated to form the international standards, and will, going forward, I think, as I said, be the kind of global benchmark around which we'll have a baseline set of sustainability reporting standards. I should also note, sorry, that the ISSB is also it has also kind of brought in the international integrated reporting standards. So it's quite a big initiative done by the IFRS, and one to be really commended. And I think will really change the way that we report going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be really exciting when we see that, because I think a lot of people that we speak to, they're kind of slightly put off that there isn't any standardization or what standardization, so they're not really sure what to work with. But obviously, once that comes in, we'll have a much better kind of framework to align ourselves with. But like you said earlier, Mark, around the heterogenealities, there's always going to be some metrics or some information relevant for your business or your asset class, which again is not necessarily going to be included in a standardized document. So it's again looking at the additional risk areas or the elements that could affect your business from a materiality perspective relevant for that business, which I think is also worth kind of collating and reporting on, or at least taking note of when you're reporting to these boards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think materiality is going to be is a key issue. You know, and I alluded to it in my presentation, which is that different organizations will have different material issues affecting them, and different sectors have different types of issues as well. So there is, within the standards boards, there's going to be a certain element of freedom, to kind of go down a certain direction. But I think what's really important is, say, for example, like climate change, we will now have a really strong set of standards to report against, which we haven't had before.
Very interesting. And I see another question is, in which jurisdiction are you seeing the main take-up of ESG compliance?
It's a good question. From what we've seen and from the conversations we've had, especially specifically more on the fund side, is that we've seen, apart from some of the developing countries which have been doing or managing ESG for a large number of years, so for Africa, for instance, when they're looking for DFI investments, they've been having to show and report on ESG metrics to ensure that they have that governance in place for kind of 10 plus years. So they've already been doing these things for a long period of time. But in terms of the more developed markets that we've seen, we're really seeing it an increase, especially in Europe, with things like SFTR coming in. And a lot of this change, a lot of the movements in terms of ESG have been through a regulatory ISET. So from a regulatory board saying, right, we require disclosures, or we require some level of reporting from yourself. So with SFTR, or the Sustainable Financial Disclosure regulations coming in Europe, that really led to a take up in Europe of firms which are not only interested in ESG, but actually have to start reporting on it now. So it's something that's been brought to the light, and they're really having to report on these areas. Again, we're seeing similar regulations or items coming in Hong Kong and Singapore, and the SEC are also announcing their own versions similar to these. So we're seeing a bit of take up in Asia and the US as well. I think the US are currently slightly behind where we are in Europe, where we're not doing that level of granularity in that reporting, but now it's on everyone's radar, and especially in Europe, where funds are actually having to disclose and report on things. I think it's breached that level from, okay, I'm not really going to focus on ESG, to now I am looking at something to do with ESG, so I might as well improve on it and add and do it properly, which we're seeing a lot of firms where they're saying, okay, now I'm reporting a little bit, I might as well do it properly and report on everything. So that's kind of how I've seen the market moving recently.
I think, Lev, also just to add to Alex's point around the SEC, I was at a conference last week, and what was clear is that whilst the US has historically been behind Europe in terms of its take up of ESG and ESG disclosure and regulation, there's a sense now that the US is looking to leapfrog, to build on the work that Europe's done and other jurisdictions globally, and really start to kind of move this forward. And one of the really interesting things to come out of the US, which I think is driving quite a lot of the interest in sustainability, is the idea of B Corps or B corporations, and that's a really interesting idea, which we can get into in a little bit more detail, albeit that I'm not a massive expert on B Corps, but yeah, it's really interesting to see how the US is going to develop.
Very interesting. You know, it's interesting you guys say that. You know, I feel like I don't have as much visibility of where it's being taken up most, but at least from my conversations with partners and clients, and just those who are interested in hearing more about ESG and you know, and having our services on it, it's actually been pretty strong in the UK compared to other Europeans and other European countries that I've or people from other European countries I spoke to. It seems to have it seems to garner the most interest in the UK, and I don't know if that's just a coincidence from my experience, or if there's actually a reason for that. But I've always had that impression that it's taken more seriously in the UK. Do you guys feel that way as well?
I think the UK has always been seen to be the kind of one of the leaders in corporate governance, and with the development of the new corporate governance code and the stewardship code, as well as the European legislation coming through, I think it's fair to say that the UK is, and in my experience, having spoken to people at the FCA and elsewhere, there's a strong desire for the UK to maintain its leadership in the corporate governance sense. So I think you'll consistently see the UK putting pressure on its investors to move this agenda forward.
Yeah, but I mean, and adding to that, I mean, you're saying if it's UK or other parts of Europe, we've seen a lot of uptake in our service centres in Luxembourg and Netherlands, etc. Again, around SFDR and supporting funds which are launching in those jurisdictions and really helping our clients understand what's specifically required for them if they're an Article 6, 8 or 9 fund, and how they kind of breach that gap to that reporting to make sure they are in line with what's required under those new regulations.
Interesting. I also have there's a question here that I guess I'll kick off my opinion on it. It's asking how can a company actively improve its ESG reputation? Which I think is a very interesting question, and I don't think I touched on this one element early on in the presentation. Sorry, just for a moment. Sorry about that. I had to prevent an interruption. So I don't believe I touched on this as much as maybe I should have. And I spoke about how to prevent a kind of a negative ESG reputation essentially, and how to do the due diligence on whom you should do the due diligence, which I do think is very important. And I feel like I spoke maybe a lot about prevention. But actually improving it, one thing that I think is really important and really not necessarily easy to do, but much more controllable is your internal policies, essentially. And what I think people are realizing much more is there's a lot of eyes now, so to speak, on, like I said, how a company manages itself internally, who's getting promoted, who's the payment of its employees, the benefits offered to them, essentially how it treats them, its recycling policies internally, things like that. People are looking in some ways, especially bigger companies. It really just depends on your sector, especially companies that have a lot more environmental impact. Also, by the way, companies that, which has a lot to do with the gap between perception and reality, is that companies who kind of present themselves as champions of change in this regard, they get targeted in a way, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. People want to hold them accountable. People want to see if they're sincere and genuine. And so they look in all angles, but one of the things that will easily be exposed is easy to expose is your internal policies. Again, who sits on your board, who is your executives, executive compensation, and things like that are super important. And again, it's something you can much easier control, I believe. So
I would also add, Lev, that the thing that people see the most, or especially in I suppose client kind of retail facing businesses, is this idea of purpose. And if you can start to embed sustainability into your corporate purpose, and really indicate to the market that sustainability is essentially a strategic issue, I think that will help improve your reputation globally.
Yeah, and I think I'll add on that. Something that came to me while you were doing your presentation, actually, Lev, is the idea around kind of cybersecurity from a risk perspective. So it's something that firms have looked at quite heavily over the last kind of 10 years or so. And to give an example, I was reading a couple of months ago around Capital One, the banking group, and in somewhere in the late 2010s, they had a hack, and hackers stole social security information, bank account information, and in 2 weeks that company lost 14% of its share price. So again, but that's a lot of companies are taking cybersecurity from a risk perspective quite heavily in hand, but that's only one part of the governance for ESG, and it's only one section. So again, that's being looked at from a risk management to make sure none of those leaks or security issues happen. But people should be paying the same level of attention to the rest of the business around the governance and the reputation and things that could have an adverse effect on the share price of a company. Because, as you mentioned, it just takes one incident or one effect which can seriously kind of have a big detriment on a company, and it's hard to build up that reputation again once that's happened.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And like I said, you see a lot of, there's a variety of scandals these days, and you see them coming up a lot of the time. And I guess one way to look at it is seeing what is problematic, seeing what is getting the attention of the general public, and understanding that these are kind of things that these are trends that aren't going away, and these are the things that people are looking at. Those are the kind of things you can control and address.
To that point, I think if companies don't address climate change, for example, I think that they will be missing a trick in terms of their corporate reputation. I think climate change has gone beyond a materiality assessment to being almost ubiquitous for all businesses. So I think it'll very quickly become a kind of a standard that you'll see businesses committing to net zero targets by a certain period. And if a business hasn't done that, I think you'll start to see, well, certainly from investors, from an investor perspective, some serious questions been asked.
And it's the changes in that macro landscape in terms of ESG. So things following on from COP26, as an example, it's the change in the macro land, which is going to come into the actual businesses and affect how people report and how businesses operate as a whole to try and hit those macro global targets that we now have.
Yeah, totally. This one's interesting. I think, Alex, this one maybe for you, it's a bit cynical, which I like, but will people actually choose between ESG and their wallet, basically? And in this person's words, and I'll let you answer, but I guess just to kick it off, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the point that you were making earlier is that you kind of don't have to.
I mean, yeah, it's a good question. Well, like you say, that there is a premise where obviously we were looking at earlier around implementing strong practices over the long term does have that financial benefit for your firm or for your company. So not in the first or second years, but over kind of a 3 to 5 year period, which again, it coincidentally is the period for a private equity company that's held. That does add value at exit, it adds improvements across your business, and it does lead to impact and value when you're leaving the business. But I think even if it's just in that initial first year stage when you're looking at strong governance and making sure everything's happy, if you don't do that and then there's an issue or something adverse pops up, then your share price or the company value falls or completely comes into free fall. Then you'll be thinking, well, I should have done that in the past. And it's making sure that you're not leaving yourself up to that tail risk or that idiosyncratic risk of something happening to your business, which, again, as I said earlier, it's not spending money to potentially make money, although in the 3 to 5 year period that does happen, it is seen to happen, but it's spending money to make sure the financial value of your investments does not fall into free fall from something adverse affecting your business.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, at least from what I've read and from what I've heard you say. Mark, do you have anything to say about that?
Look, I think from my perspective anyway, the idea that you're trading ESG for performance, I think that whole argument has kind of fallen by the wayside. To Alex's point, it's risk mitigation on one side, but it's also there's a huge opportunity set. And as society moves towards this transition to a low carbon economy, we're going to be talking about opportunities rather than risks. And if your business isn't positioned to take care of those opportunities, you're going to be missing out. So I think society has kind of moved on from this idea that ESG is a net cost. That's something that would be borne by the business, to ESG is actually a net benefit to any organization. And there's a kind of a commercial imperative to making sure that you get it right. I mean, you just look at,
Yeah.
I mean, there's countless examples of that. I'll stop there. I can go on. But
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, I mean, I like these kind of questions. That's why I guess I enjoy kind of discussions, because a lot of opinions, and I guess not always enough time to answer them. But I think we all have extensive thoughts on these questions. At this point, I don't see any more. Just double check. I don't see any more questions. Nope. Yeah, so I guess there are no more questions. We can conclude. From my end, it was a pleasure. I really enjoyed doing this. I really enjoyed partnering with Alex and Mark and IQEQ to present this, and hopefully we do more such presentations. It was a lot of fun, really great. Really enjoyed doing the research for it and putting it all together. And so I also appreciate you all joining us today, and really cool questions that you asked, really thought provoking as well, and very relevant. So I enjoy that engagement from everyone, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lev, and thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure to take part. And as you see, everyone's got our contact information there. So if you do have any further questions, we're always available. Always happy to kind of answer those and help with any issues or queries you might have.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Lev. Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.